Bienvenidas y bienvenidos nuevamente. Seguimos en el marco de las Jornadas Monetarias y Bancarias 2020 del Banco Central de la República Argentina. En el marco del tercer panel de las jornadas, esta actividad la vamos a compartir con Daniela Gabor, subgerenta general de regulación financiera en el Banco Central. Yo soy Germán Feldman, economista jefe del banco, y en esta oportunidad tenemos como expositora a Daniela Prates, que es funcionaria superior de Asuntos Económicos de la UNTAD y que va a estar presentando sobre soberanía monetaria y política macroeconómica en las economías emergentes. Daniela Prates es funcionaria superior de Asuntos Económicos de la Conferencia de las Naciones Unidas sobre Comercio y Desarrollo y profesora asociada del Instituto de Economía de la Universidad de Campinas. También es miembro del Foro de Macroeconomía y Políticas Macroeconómicas FMM. Sus principales áreas de investigación son la economía internacional y la macroeconomía abierta, con enfoque en cuestiones monetarias y financieras y las economías de mercados emergentes. So, Daniela, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Many thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to participate in this conference. My presentation was on monetary sovereignty and macroeconomic policy in emerging market economies. And I would like to start stressing that this is really a hot topic, because the global economy is now facing, as everyone know, huge economic, health and social crisis that is the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression of the 1930s. But it would be far worse if it were not for the massive counter-cyclical macroeconomic policy response launched by advanced economies and also emerging market economies. However, the scale of the response of these two groups of economies have been very, very different. So here in this figure that are IMF data, we could see that this is the fiscal response and the in percentage of the GDP. So really the blue bars are the advanced economies, how the scale of the response was really, really greater. The same happened in the regarding monetary policy. So advanced economies also adopt a more expressive response in terms of scale and diversity of instruments. But the emerging market economies, we could say that this time, this crisis was the time when the scale of the emerging market economies response was the record in history. So it was really greater than at the time of the global financial times of 2008 and 2009. And involve now in the COVID crisis also a broader diversity of instruments. So it was bolder and also broader in terms of diversity of instruments. So we could see in this figure that all regions adopted many instruments, and the most important was the cut, the decrease in the policy rate, the central bank interest rate. But the other important issue to mention is that for the first time, many central banks adopted asset purchase programs that is known as the quantitative easing policy. Then this was also a new feature of this crisis. And I would like to highlight one important instrument that was a specificity of emerging market economies, that are the central bank's intervention in the foreign exchange market. And in my presentation, we'll understand why emerging market economy central banks need also to intervene in the foreign exchange market. And this is not the case of advanced economies. Then the question I would like to respond or to give some of the explanation for this question is that question: what are the main determinants of the degree of macroeconomic policy autonomy, or that we also call policy space, and mainly why advanced economies have a higher degree of policy space than emerging market economies? Then my hypothesis is this difference is related to two issues. One is the position of each currency, each country currency in the currency hierarchy of the international monetary system. And I will explain in more detail what is this currency hierarchy. And the other important determinant is the degree of monetary sovereignty. But we also have, we also see that between emerging market economies, there are also a different degree of policy space. Then, in this, what is the explanation? The degree of monetary sovereignty also varies more than the position in the currency hierarchy, as we will see. But two other factors are important: the macroeconomic constraints, and in this case, mainly the external constraints, and the macroeconomic policy regime. Then now I will explore detail mainly the two first issues, given the time constraints, and I will also talk about the two other issues, the macroeconomic constraints and macroeconomic policy regime. Regarding the currency hierarchy, here we have only one indicator of what are this currency hierarchy. We know that we don't have an international currency. And the dollar that performs the role of international currency. This means that the dollar performs the role of unit of account, means of payment, and reserve of value in the international monetary system, financial systems in the international economy. And one indicator of that is the use of the dollar as unit of account of the external debt of developing economies. And Argentina, you and Argentina, as I'm Brazilian, all developing countries know what this means for us, the problem that this could bring. Then we see how the dollar predominates. We have some whole of the euro and of the yen, but the dollar has this higher share because the dollar is the international currency. That is the key currency that performs the role of international currency. Then I follow what I call, and I have also co-authors, but I call in my thesis a Keynesian structuralist approach. What is this? Firstly, this idea that the international monetary system is a hierarchical system is an original idea of Keynes. And Keynes, in the Bretton Woods Conference, that is the conference that was held in 1944, at the end of the Second World War, to elaborate a new international monetary system. So Keynes at this conference present a proposal that was not accepted or not won, that we need to have international currency, because any system that is anchored in a key currency is hierarchical and brings asymmetries. We have never had in history an international currency. So since the 19th century pound standard, gold pound standard, we have a key currency. So was the pound, and now is the US dollar since the 1945. So it's exactly because of that that we have in the international monetary system a currency hierarchy. So this pyramid is an illustration of this hierarchy. So the dollar is at the top because the dollar is the international currency, the international money. And because of that, the dollar has a higher degree of liquidity. What is the degree of liquidity? The money is the most liquid asset that is accepted for settled transactions, that is the unit of account, that also denominate the assets that will be held as a set of value. And below the dollar, we have the other currencies. But one important issue that Keynes didn't highlight is that we also have an asymmetry between what we call now, I was calling the advanced economies and emerging market economies. But what are the emerging market economies? The emerging market economies, as the concept I adopt, but is in the reality, what they are the peripheral countries that have engaged in this international monetary system anchored in the dollar and in the financial globalization. Then we have in the international monetary system also a center periphery structure. So this is an idea of the structuralism approach that has as a founding father, as you know, Randall Wray, that was a president of the Argentina Central Bank in the 1930s, at the time of the Great Depression. And that has become the first executive director of ECLAC, the Economic Commission of Latin America and Caribbean, and also the first Secretary General of UNCTAD. Then Prabish highlighted that at his time that the international economy has an international division of labor that in the periphery is functional for the center, but also dependent to the center. And at that time, what was really important for Prabish, or that what we call the classical structuralism. At the time of Bretton Woods, when we have capital controls, we have fixed exchange rates. So at that time, the most, harmful, negative consequence of this asymmetry in the international economy was the deterioration of the terms of trade. That was Prabish, one of the key ideas of Prabish. So at that time, we had, as José Antonio Campo called, a trade account dominance. So the external constraint that emerging at the time now that peripheral economies, countries faced, was through mainly the trade account because of the terms of trade deterioration. But now what we have a system, now we are at the post-Bretton Woods system featured by a flexible exchange rates, regulated capital flows, and the so-called financial globalization. Then in this system, emerging market economies, now the peripheral countries that have become emerging market economies, face many shocks that are financial shocks. So we still face external constraints because of the composition of our exports. Not mainly countries still are exporters of commodities, as Argentina, Brazil, and others, but also financial shocks. Then, what happened with these economies? So the peripheral countries, the emerging market economies, their currencies are at the bottom of the currency hierarchy, as we could see in the figure. So the peripheral currencies issued by emerging market economies are at the bottom. Why? Because they don't perform any function of money at the international level. And this results in a huge constraint in their policy space. So we could see in this figure that the lower the degree of liquidity, the lower the degree of policy space. But why this happened? What we need to understand, the transmission channels, why this position of the currency hierarchy results in a lower policy space. So in this post-Bretton Woods system, the system is featured in the financial globalization by a high volatility of exchange rates and of capital flows. But emerging market economies that face the greater volatility. So they are very vulnerable to the boom bursts of capital flows. So what happened in this current crisis, in the COVID crisis? So at this figure, we could see that the outflows in the 91st days of the crisis. So here comparing the global financial crisis, the so-called taper tantrum of May 2013, that is when the Federal Reserve announced that he will cut off, reduce the quantitative easing, and the COVID crisis. So we could see that these capital outflows between mostly mid-February and mid-March was the record in history. So we could see the dimension of this crisis. And so what happened? These outflows resulted in huge exchange rate depreciations. But exactly because our foreign debt, the foreign debt of emerging market economies is denominated in dollar, the depreciation result in, because we have the currency mismatch. And so the depreciation resulting a huge impact, a adverse impact in the financial situation of governments, corporations, financial institutions that are indebted in dollars. Other negative impact on inflation. Depreciation has so have a high pass-through to inflation. So is why the emerging market economy central banks also needed to intervene in the foreign exchange market to curb this depreciation that has huge negative effects to their economies. And then these economies couldn't adopt a free floating regime. They needed to adopt a dirty floating, so to intervene in the foreign exchange market. So and because of that, we have a interrelation, a really close interrelation between the exchange rate policy and the monetary policy in emerging market economies. And this results in a lower policy space. Then what, in fact, happened? Not what the mainstream of macroeconomics call the trilemma. What is the trilemma? Is that if we have a free capital mobility and floating exchange rates, so this will result in macroeconomic policy autonomy. But this don't doesn't happen. If we have capital mobility and regulate capital flows, this results mainly for emerging market economies in a lower degree of macroeconomic autonomy, even with floating exchange rates. So this is really an important determinant of this lower degree of macroeconomic policy autonomy. But it's not only the position of the currency hierarchy that explains the lower policy space. So during the global financial crisis, and we saw what happened just after the euro crisis. So the euro crisis brought to light that even if you are at a high level of the currency hierarchy, as it's the case of the euro, just below the dollar, you could have a lower policy space to respond to a crisis. So this happened with the euro. Why? Because the low degree of monetary sovereignty. Then we need to also consider the monetary sovereignty. In the case, I will detail below and give some examples, but before that, I would only like to summarize what I understand as monetary sovereignty, because we have many concepts of monetary sovereignty. Then, what I'm meaning by monetary sovereignty? So, we need the concepts of monetary sovereignty. They have two anchors, two bases: the concept of sovereignty and the approach of money. So when I'm talking about sovereignty, I'm talking about political sovereignty. So the national state that defines the money of account and that issues the money that responds to this money of account. So this is really based on Keynes, the Keynesian view of money. And of sovereignty, of sovereignty is Keynes used this definition of sovereignty when he didn't talk about monetary sovereignty explicitly, but this is the idea. And the approach of money, why is important? Because in Argentina, it's not sufficient that I have a state, no. So the unit account is the peso, and I issue the peso. But the population, people, individuals, enterprise needed to accept the money. It's not sufficient that the direto that enforce, we have the state defining this. So we needed to have the acceptability of money. So, and why this is important? Because money is not only a money of account, is a debt, credit debt relation, is an asset that people want to hold money when they face huge uncertainty. And so money depends, the demand for money depends on confidence. So this is the why it's really complicated, the discussion of monetary sovereignty, because we could have, in legal terms, we could have this monetary sovereignty, but this what is that matter is if in fact, in reality, this money is demanded by the population. And another dimension that is important is the role of the treasury and of the central bank. So to have monetary sovereignty, and in this case also the case of the euro, besides the case of Argentina and other emerging market economies also show, but the case of the euro show how is important a treasury. So a treasury that will define the tax system, will impose the tax, will issue the bonds that will finance, besides tax, the state expenditures. And we need to have a central bank, because the central bank is the issuer of the state money, and that at last resort, the central bank has the ability to monetize the treasury, the state debt. But this is really a last resort issue, because we know, don't have time to detail here, but we know how the monetary financing and all this issue of monetizing that is really complicated, complex, indeed, because of the financialization of the economy. So this is the concept of monetary sovereignty. And then what we could, I try to summarize in this figure, how we could classify countries regarding the degree of policy space. So we need to distinguish the degree of monetary sovereignty and the position in the currency hierarchy. Then if we take into account these two dimensions, we could see that we have 6 different cases. The United States is the country that has the greater degree of policy space. Sure, because is the issuer of the key currency and has also monetary sovereignty. So the dollar is the only unit of account, is only means of payment and the reserve of value in the United States. The United States has, the dollar is accepted, and the United States has the treasury, has the central bank that performs all the functions. Second degree, we have the other advanced or center or developed economies. So like the United Kingdom, Japan, and Canada, and others that have monetary sovereignty. In third place, the euro, because the euro has the second position in the currency hierarchy, but the euro is still, the euro countries don't have monetary sovereignty, even if now the situation is better than at the time of the global financial crisis, and is why they could adopt more counter-cyclical monetary policy than even fiscal policy than at 2009. And after that, we have the emerging market economies that issue the peripheral currencies. So in this case, what will differentiate? We have, with no doubt, China now has a different position than the other emerging market economies. So is why I put China a little above the other countries in the scale of the currency hierarchy, because the renminbi currently already perform some currency of money with a higher degree than all the emerging market economies. But in the other case, we have really, the difference is really small. It's not so relevant. Argentina and Ecuador, now we could say, okay, they are in an even lower position because they now just finished the process of restructure the external debt. And because of that, international investors are demanding less, or even will start to demand, we know, because they search for you. But we could say that now they are even in a lower position than the other emerging market economies. But what is more important in the case of emerging market economies, in my opinion, is not so the difference in the currency hierarchy, because these are very, very small. All of these currencies are peripheral, that don't perform functions of money at the international level. So what is really different is the degree of monetary sovereignty. And in this case, we know that we see different groups of countries. So countries like Brazil, even Mexico, less than Brazil, but also and all the many countries in Asia, like India, Thailand, Indonesia, and others, that has monetary sovereignty, that don't face a foreign currency as a competitor in the national at the national level. But we have countries that so let's talk. The opposite is Ecuador. Nowadays, Ecuador is in Latin America. That is a country that has no monetary sovereignty because it has dollarization. So don't have a domestic currency. And we have the case, the intermediary case, where is Argentina, but also other emerging market economies as Peru and Turkey, that besides the domestic currency, that have a foreign currency, the dollar, or in the case of Turkey, or also the euro, that also performs functions of the money at the national level. And because of that, this constrains the capacity of the central bank and even of the treasury to launch countercyclical policies. But in the case of these countries, so if you look at these countries that are in the 4th and 5th position, so how they could increase the degree of monetary macroeconomic policy autonomy. So I think this is one of the most important issues that these countries face, because to climb the currency hierarchy is really a medium long-term process. And I don't have time to detail this, but it's really, we could say, it's not possible for these economies. Then these economies that have the monetary sovereignty, what will differentiate the degree of policy space? Then what I call the macroeconomic constraints. So the two most important are the external constraints and the fiscal constraints. But in the case of these economies, exactly because their position in the currency hierarchy and also other structural factors that the structuralist has emphasized, the composition of exports, the composition of imports, the insertion in the international division of labor, all these factors result in external vulnerability, and then the higher the external vulnerability, the lower the policy space. So many economies, we could say, after the financial crisis of the 90s, has adopted the precautionary demand for reserves. So accumulated international reserves as one with the aim of reduce the vulnerability to external shocks. But this is not sufficient because we need to generate foreign currency through our exports. So we need these foreign currency revenues to reduce our external fragility, vulnerability, and to increase our policy space. The other important determinant are the macroeconomic regime. But the macroeconomic regime I define as a combination of macroeconomic policies and the institutional framework. Why the institutional framework is important? Because the degree of financial openness is very, very important. The higher the degree of financial openness, the lower the policy space. So if we reduce the degree of financial openness, the economy has a higher degree of policy space. The exchange rate regime and also the institutional framework of the monetary policy. In the case of situation 5, that where Argentina is, so besides these two factors, that countries in situation for also face, I think the challenge is to increase the degree of monetary sovereignty. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Daniela, for your presentation. It was very broad and complete. It's a very interesting perspective to have this kind of center and peripheral distinction and the concept of monetary sovereignty and currency hierarchies. It's very interesting. I think that emerging economies, we are, as I can understand for your presentation, are by nature with lower policy space than advanced economies because of the position and the degree of currency hierarchy we are, and not always with the monetary sovereignty we want to have. So that's why you mentioned the need of some policy responses, like for example the need of some foreign exchange policy interventions, for example. As you mentioned, that the COVID crisis is one of the biggest crises in history, as bigger and has hit the real economy harder than the 2008 crisis. And emerging economies are facing higher capital outflows than then. We have US dollar prevalence, and we have still high dependence on global investors' decisions. So in that context, emerging markets are vulnerable to those external shocks, and we don't have developed capital markets to absorb those shocks as we wanted to. So sudden reversals or hard behavior that are characteristics of this kind of asset managers and this kind of asset industry, these behaviors can undermine our financial conditions. So you talk about a lot of mechanisms and ways as how central banks could deal with that external shock. And you talk about forex intervention, and what do you think is the role of capital flows management measures and also macroprudential policies? That's my first question. Then I have another question that is regarding, it's in the same context, but more regarding what is the position and what is the role, or what should be, or what is the role of the international community or the international organizations or standard setting bodies, or in terms of the recognition of these policies responses?
Thank you for the questions. Then I have also the opportunity to detail more. One really issue that is one of my research topic is for many years, that is exactly the capital account management. We have different terms for the same thing, or capital account regulation, or capital account measures, capital management measures. I think that the only way, I think, when I talk about this macroeconomic regime and use this concept, exactly because we couldn't analyze the macroeconomic policies without taking into consideration the institutional framework. And one crucial pillar of this institutional framework is the degree of financial openness. How emerging market economies could reduce the degree of financial openness? is exactly adopting capital account management measures. And that also, the term, the old term, that is capital controls. So exactly, we need to reduce the speculative flows that came to us, or that let's talk about is not the portfolio investments, the portfolio investment that or that come to buy assets or treasury bonds mainly, or equity in our the emerging market economies, domestic markets, or also by the external bonds issued in the international capital markets. So these are the same asset managers that, and the aim is, as you know, they are searching for you. In the case of Argentina, you know, I think more than the Brazilians, that, okay, you could default, you could give a moratoria, but some months after they return, because they are betting, they are speculative. And then this kind of capital, what advantage they bring? They bring volatility. Okay, they bring currency appreciation. That is really complicated. You know, also in Argentina, how the currency appreciation also has benefits. So in Brazil, what we have during the PT government, we have an increase in the purchase power of the population because of currency appreciation. But the problem is that in the medium and long term, currency appreciation results in deindustrialization. And so we are even more exporters of commodities. And then we come back to previous issue. That is that we still facing the deterioration of terms of trade. Then the capital account management measures has, I think they have two aims. One is macroeconomic, to reduce the instability of the exchange rate and the interest rate, because these countries, the currencies are in the bottom of the currency hierarchy, and they have a lower liquidity premium, we need to have a spread in our interest rate in relation with the interest rate of the dollar. So in this crisis, everyone, okay, cut the interest rate, but our interest rate is still higher than advanced economies. And this one key reason is exactly because we needed to pay a difference to attract the foreign capital. Then, if we have these measures, we will reduce the volatility of macroeconomic prices, exchange rate, interest rate, and also reduce the financial instability, because these capital flows, when they go out, as happened in the COVID, there is not only currency depreciation that happened, the price of assets also decrease, so we have a price deflation that also is harmful for the economies. But regarding prudential regulation, I seek capital controls and prudential regulation. Prudential regulation could be is broader in the sense that we have prudential regulation related with the operation, the domestic operation of the financial system, but we also have prudential regulation that is important also as a capital account measure, because some kinds of capital flows, we need prudential regulation and not capital controls. So we needed to use these two instruments, tools, depending on the kind of capital flows, depending on the kind of the borrower, of the agent that is on that in foreign currency. Then if you look at even the IMF position, the IMF has changed his position regarding capital controls. Now, the IMF is more, how we say, positive. Yeah. But the IMF view is still has an important shortcoming, that they still saying that capital controls is at last resort. So you need to use emerging macroeconomists need to use first monetary policy, fiscal policy, exchange rate policy, prudential regulation. And if all of this don't work, capital controls. But it's not like this, because in many cases, you need first to use capital controls. So to increase the degree of macroeconomic policy autonomy, and then you will be able to use your macroeconomic policy autonomy. Then the second point that is related with that. So the international community, I think that we needed to recognize that, I think mainly in the case of IMF, the IMF has been changing its view. So regarding capital controls, if you compare today to the 90s, yes. We have now a better, we could say a better position in my point of view. Was a position that is not so different from my position. If we comparing to what they support in the 80s, in the 90s. Also regarding fiscal policies, now they just launched the World Economic Outlook, Global Financial Stability Report. So if we read these reports now, and at the time of the global financial crisis, we also see how the IMF now is much more in support of counter-cyclical policies, even in the case of emerging market economies. So they changed it, but the problem is that this system is, the structure of the system is asymmetric. Exactly because the very position of the dollar. So I think this point of Keynes is really fundamental, that if any system with a key currency, the issuer of the key currency will always have an exorbitant privilege, as the French Minister of Finance of de Gaulle called in the 60s. But is this situation? We could change this in the short term, no. But there are some actions that could be adopted, as the increase of the SDRs, of the special drawing rights, that is the currency of the IMF. So this is one, in the COVID crisis, UNCTAD, and also other economies as Ocampo, and are supporting this. We need to increase the special drawing rights, and even also redistributed, because we have two problems, that the IMF could, so let's increase, adopt a new issuance of special drawing rights. This will be important, but we could also have a redistribution, because there are many countries, advanced economies, that have special drawing rights that could lend them to emerging market economies that are facing problems. We also have a structural problem in the international monetary financial system. And you, Argentina, know very well the credit rating agencies, the power they have to put pressure in countries. Sorry. So even this program of the G20 of the debt relief, not debt relief, the suspension of the service of the external debt of the poorest countries, the DSSI, the debt suspension, the debt suspension service initiative.
Yes.
So many countries that are eligible didn't accept, didn't join. Why? Because they are fearful, with fear that the credit agents and the private creditors will close the market for them. Then what could be the solution? Maybe a public credit agency. So we needed to discuss that how to, even if we couldn't change this structural feature of the system, how we could improve the system. We also needed to have a debt restructuring mechanism with rules that will, as in the case of the restructure of Argentina debt, if we have rules, accepted rules between creditors and debtors countries on the main features that these negotiations could have, we will have also a better system for debtors countries. Because what we have only institutions that at the end they are at the side of the creditors. We need to have an agency or an institution that will be at the side of debtors countries, and that could also help these countries to in debt restructure negotiations. Then I think that we still have space to adopt measures to improve the system. But as you know, the problem, as was the problem at the time of Bretton Woods, is that we have the power relations that shape this system. Then developing countries, the G77, we have the G77 that was the group that created UNCTAD, and the Prebisch was the how we say, Prebisch proposed to have this first conference on trade development, and the G77 supported, and so UNCTAD was created because of that, because of this group of countries. So this group of countries that needed to join, because only in this way they will have more power to support this kind of measures that will be beneficial for developing countries.
Daniela, let me make you a last question. You presented like two very relevant concepts, the notions of currency hierarchy and monetary sovereignty. As you said, currency hierarchy is like a given. I mean, our peripheral currencies are what they are, and they're in the lowest position in this triangle. So we should focus on the policy space, on the monetary sovereignty dimension. And you emphasize first the the macroeconomic constraint, and especially the external constraint. So I think what you have in mind is the relevance of industrial policy as a way to modify the productive structure and therefore to increase the rate of exports and reduce the income elasticity of imports. Then you mentioned regarding the macroeconomic regime, the importance of the degree of financial openness, and that we peripheral countries should reduce the degree of financial openness in order to increase the policy space. And in terms of the exchange rate regime, that we should be away from these fully flexible or floating regimes. But I would like to hear what do you think about the third point in this macroeconomic regime regarding the institutional framework of monetary policy, if you could extend on this idea, on this point.
Sure. Thank you very much. Then, as you know, I'm a Brazilian economist. Before joining UNCTAD, I was professor of economics in Brazil of the University of Campinas. Then I have already studied other developing countries, even Argentina, Mexico, but more comparing the experience in the 90s. So more recently, I haven't had the opportunity to update my study on Argentina and Mexico. Mexico, I had the opportunity because of students, but then I'm saying that because many of my ideas on that are also influenced by the Brazilian experience. Then when you see, but in general are also problems that other emerging economies face, but mainly the emerging market economies that adopt the inflation target regime. Because what happened is that Argentina had a different trajectory, but after the currency crisis of the 90s, so Mexico, Brazil, even Asian countries, even in India more recently, adopt the inflation target. So we have this combination of flexible floating exchange rate, but that in fact is dirty floating and inflation target. And in the inflation target, my position, I'm a post-Keynesian. Then I think I'm not, I'm not agree with inflation target for in general, but even more for emerging market economies, for peripheral economies. For many reasons that I will not detail this because it will be another lecture. But one problem, many problems, two I would like to highlight. One is that it's not only inflation that the monetary policy needed to target, because even the United States, okay, you say me, oh, but it's the issue of the key currency, but it's the United States. So our example, the Federal Reserve has a dual mandate. So it's inflation and employment and growth. Then this is the first point. So when we talk about institutional framework of monetary policy, we need to think about what is the aim of the monetary policy. So I think that we need to have the aim of inflation. We know very well in Argentina, in Brazil, how inflation is harmful. We don't want inflation, but we also want growth of the employment, growth of the economy. Then I think the inflation target is a problem. But even if we adopt inflation target, so we could say in this financial globalization, financialization, countries are very vulnerable to decision of foreign investors, of domestic investors that are the buyers of the domestic debt. Then they need to accept the inflation target, because otherwise the money will go out, will flight, capital flight, etc. But in this case, inflation target, we also could have different institutional framework that could give a higher degree of flexibility, or we could say of autonomy to the monetary policy. So one example, important example, in the case of Brazil, the inflation target is in the year. So we have a target in the year. But we could have a shock. El Nino, a natural shock, climate shock, that now is even more frequent. And this could so have an impact inflation that will be disappear next year. So if I have a target a moving target or a 2 years target, this will, even if in inflation target, will increase, even that not so much, but will give more flexibility to the management of the inflation target by the central bank. So this is one I think one example. The second example, even the price index that is the reference. So also, sorry, in the case of Brazil, we have the central bank price index of reference has a higher share of what we call monetary prices, that price that are indexed to past inflation. So because of this, we have a inertia. So the past inflation influence the current inflation. So this is other pillar that could be changed. So the kind of price index. But another important feature is how the central bank pursues his open market operations. I don't know how in Argentina now you manage this, but in Brazil we use the repo operations. So the repo and the reverse repo. But the problem is that these operations, that in Brazil we call operações compromissadas, I don't know in Spanish, they are included in the public debt. Mm-hmm. So this is a problem because the issue of that I mentioned, the interrelation between the monetary policy and the exchange rate policy. So when the central bank of Brazil, in the phases of boom of capital flows, what happened? Many dollars, now we have excess of dollars in the exchange, the currency market. The central bank needed to buy dollars to stop the fall in the price of the dollar, the appreciation of the real, even if if they like the appreciation because of the inflation target, but not so when it's really too big, they intervene. This will result in excess of reais, our currency in the monetary market. Then the central bank needed to adopt to the reverse repo, so to buy this liquid from banks. And this will increase the repo operations. But these repo operations are included in the public debt. What is the problem? The problem is we know that one criteria that investors look at, credit agents, investors, is that public debt to the GDP. So in Brazil, the public debt to GDP increased only because monetary policy operations. It's not because the government is expanding too much. It's putting pressure in the aggregated demand. Then, how this could be changed? Now, in Brazil, this is at the Congress to be voted. We could create this remunerated deposits. So banks could deposit the excess of liquidity, and the central bank will pay the same interest rate. So in this case, the cost is the same, but will not be included in the public debt. So I want to try to give 3 examples of how the institutional framework could change and could increase, even if it's not a huge increase, but could increase the policy space. And in this case, is only the decision of the government, of the Congress, is in the hands of the countries. It's not in the hands of foreign investors.
Well, Daniela, thank you very much again for this very interesting presentation and discussion.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very
Was my
much.
pleasure.
Pleasure.